Welcome to this week's Midweek Meditation. Pride and Prejudice is a book that most people have heard of, even if they have never read it. It's regarded as a classic and been adapted a number of times for TV and film. When Elizabeth meets Darcy for the first time, she is immediately prejudiced against him because he behaves in a proud way. This makes her quick to believe all the bad things she is told about him by another character, and it takes a lot of unravelling before she realises the truth. This illustrates just how easy it is to judge a person on first impressions and get it wrong. If that is then reinforced by other people, we can then end up with a very false picture of what that person is actually like. Most of us have small prejudices. It might be a politician with a posh accent on the news, or a youth hanging about on a street corner with his hood up. There might be really nice people, but we make judgments about them because of accent, clothes, behaviour, and so on. A dictionary definition of prejudice is a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. The problem with prejudice is that it doesn't always remain a small thing. It can grow and become really dangerous, particularly if it is applied to a whole group of people. It is often connected to ignorance and fear. Ignorance of what another group of people are really like, and fear that that group of people will threaten us in some way. It can lead to angry words and sometimes violence against innocent people. Unfortunately, there are plenty of examples of this reported regularly in the news. So how did Jesus deal with prejudice? The simple answer is that he ignored it. He refused to allow himself to be drawn into the prejudices of his day, and instead saw people as individuals. We see an example of this in Luke 19 verses 1 to 10. Here we read about his encounter with Zacchaeus. Now Zacchaeus was a tax collector, and that was a profession that was very unpopular with ordinary people, because they worked for the Romans and often cheated people. The story tells us that Zacchaeus was a small man, and so he climbed a sycamore tree so he could see Jesus. He must have been very surprised when Jesus looked up and said in verse 5, "Hurry down, Zacchaeus, because I must stay in your house today." It tells us that Zacchaeus hurried down and welcomed him with great joy. He must have been amazed. No one like Jesus would normally want to know him. However, in verse 7 he says, all the people who saw it started grumbling. "This man has gone as a guest to the home of a sinner." Well, maybe Zacchaeus had done some wrong things, but they were certainly prejudiced against him. However, Jesus didn't care about him being a tax collector, but treated him as an individual. And the result was that Zacchaeus had a transforming experience and said, "I will give half my belongings to the poor, and if I have cheated anyone, I will pay him back 4 times as much." Another example of Jesus cutting through prejudice is the story of the woman at the well, which can be found in John 4 verses 5 to 42. Jesus sits down to rest by the well while his disciples go into the town to buy food. While he is sitting there, a Samaritan woman comes to the well to draw water, and Jesus asks her to give him a drink. Now there are 2 reasons why this was unexpected. Firstly, she was a woman, and secondly, she was a Samaritan. The Jews were very prejudiced against Samaritans, and the woman is astonished by Jesus' request. In verse 9 it explains that Jews will not use the same cups and bowls that Samaritans use. However, Jesus yet again ignores these prejudices and sees only an individual. This time the result was that not only the woman believed in Jesus, but she went back and told the whole town about him. It tells us in verse 40 that the Samaritans came to him. They begged him to stay with them, and Jesus stayed there 2 days. And in verse 41, many more believed because of his message. It seems then that we should follow Jesus' example and not allow ourselves to be affected by prejudice, but instead try to see people as individuals. Sometimes this really isn't easy, and we need to pray for God's help. Today, the prevailing prejudices are not so much about Samaritans, women, and tax collectors. Instead, it is more likely to be Muslims, Jews, and asylum seekers. I'm sure that you can think of other groups within our society that some people are prejudiced about. Jesus says in Luke 10, verse 27, "Love your neighbour as you love yourself." And when asked in verse 29, "Who is my neighbour?" he responds by telling the parable of the Good Samaritan. This surely wasn't an accident. The hero of the story is someone who probably all his listeners would have been prejudiced against. Maybe, if Jesus was telling the story today, it would have been the parable of the good asylum seeker, or some other group that people are prejudiced about. The point is that Jesus had no place for prejudice in his own life, and is making it clear that we shouldn't either. So the challenge for this week is to think about any small prejudices that we might have, and to ask God to help us to treat people as individuals, as Jesus did.